I think I've told you before that I've once had an accident and I cut my fingers off. So we don't have to go through the details. And I found that after they did some of the operations to transplant some of the nerve into my hand, they've taken a piece of nerve out of my elbow here and they've put that in my hand. Jean, the doctor, told me that God gave us each 4 spare pieces of nerve that they can use that for. And then what I discovered was that my elbow, the very tip of my elbow, was dead. Just the very tip. But in the beginning, it was strange. I would walk in the supermarket and I would think, there's a fly sitting on my elbow. So I'd go do this all the time. But there was nothing. It was just a feeling. And I had very interesting experiences of sensation through this whole process. And I remember some of them very distinctly. And it helps you to get a little bit of an idea of what it is to be a leper. Because leprosy, as you will see in a minute, is not just sores on somebody's skin, but it has to do with the nervous system that's not working properly. And in Palestine, there were 2 kinds of leprosy. There was the one which was rather like a very bad skin disease, and it was the lesser of the 2. There was one in which the disease, starting from a small spot, would grow and waste away the flesh, and of course will go so bad so far as to, you could lose fingers and ears and toes and maybe even hands or feet or whatever it is. And the regulations concerning leprosy, of course, we find there in the book of Leviticus, and in Leviticus chapter 13, the whole of that chapter, Leviticus chapter 14, the whole of that chapter tells us what should be done when somebody is a leper. The most terrible thing about it was the isolation, loneliness. The leper was to, wherever they would walk, and if somebody was approaching them, they would have to say, unclean, unclean. Imagine that, walking in the streets and shouting to people, hey, stay away, I'm unclean. I imagine some people are having to do that today anyway, maybe in their minds or whatever the case may be, depending on what the situation is. And where did they live? Where did they live? Did they have neighbors? They had to live outside, where they couldn't come in, they couldn't come close. And such people were banished from society, exiled from their home. And the result was, and still is, that the psychological consequences of leprosy was probably more serious than the physical. I'm often looking at people when I'm sitting at the station or somewhere, and I'm looking at how they do things. I was waiting for the bus a few days ago. There were 2 women. One was obviously looking after the other. The older was obviously the one in charge. The younger was one where if you just saw her, you wouldn't think anything is wrong. But the moment she starts to speak, you knew something is terribly wrong. And I'm often wondering to what extent she experiences the very same thing as what people with leprosy may have experienced. Dr. A.B. MacDonald, in an article on the leper colony in Itu, of which he was in charge, wrote, "The leper is sick in mind as well as body. For some reason, there is an attitude to leprosy different from the attitude to any other disfiguring disease. It is associated with shame and horror and carries in some mysterious way a sense of guilt, although innocently acquired like most contagious troubles. Shunned and despised, frequently do lepers consider taking their own lives, and some do." But did you catch that sentence? It says, it is associated with shame and horror. in some mysterious way, a sense of guilt, although innocently acquired, like most contagious troubles. When people speak to me about church and they feel guilty for doing something wrong, which I often have to remind them, but what's wrong about that? And they feel guilty for those things. And they've acquired knowledge of something that is apparently wrong that the church has taught them, maybe. And the leper was hated by others until he came to hate himself. That is the kind of man that came to Jesus. He was unclean, and Jesus touched him. Jesus touched the untouchable. His hand went out to the man from whom everyone else would have said, "No, I can't come close to you." Two things emerge. First, when we despise ourselves, when our hearts are filled with bitter shame, let us remember that in spite of it all, Christ's hand is still stretched out. Not so? Mark Rutherford wishes to add a new beatitude. You know all the beatitudes. Blessed are they. He wants to say, blessed are those who heal us of our self-despisings. That is what Jesus did, and that is what he still does. And secondly, it is of the very essence of Christianity to touch the untouchable. We have no business to be a church if we can't touch the untouchable. If we sit here in this nice palace and we just talk nice things about nice programs and we are not prepared. I see the grass is growing outside. What do you say? Is our smoking Sabbath school class on its way? We have to be able to touch the untouchables. Otherwise, why are we here for? Do we want to change them to be like us before they come in, or will we allow them in, maybe even if it smells? Jesus sent the man to carry out normal prescribed routine for cleansing. The regulations are described in Leviticus 14, as I said. And to say, this is to say that a miracle did not dispense with that medical science of the time could do. It did not absolve the man from carrying out the prescribed rules. He still had to go to the temple and go and tell the priest and make an offering. And we will never get miracles by neglecting the gifts and the wisdom that God has given us. It is when a man's skill combines with God's grace that wonders happen. So, leprosy. Imagine a man. He comes home after work one day. And as usual, his wife gives him food and they sit and eat around the table. They've got 2 kids. And after a while, busy eating, his wife says to him, "Well, what's that thing on your hand?" And he says, "That's from using the one tool all day. It's starting to make a blister on my hand." And so, every day goes on. He comes back from work, they have their life, they have their marriage, their house is going on, the kids go to school, and the sore on his hand is just starting to become a bit more painful and developing a little bit more. He takes it to work like that, and he keeps working like that, and then they start to both get a little alarmed about this thing that's on his hand that doesn't want to go away. And his wife says, "I think you must go see somebody about this." So he goes off and he goes and sees somebody who deals with specifically stuff on your skin. It's not necessarily a doctor, but he's trained in, putting ointments on people and stuff like that. And he looks at it, and he studies a few books that he's got lying around, And he says, well, it's very hard to know exactly what it is. I have a few theories. Does it sound like the NHS? Yeah. And then he says to the man, well, I think you better stay here by me for about 2 weeks. I want to observe and see if it gets better, or will it stay, or will it, And that's what they do. And for 2 weeks, the sore gets bigger and bigger until it almost covers the whole hand. And it becomes white around the edges. And the man is in pain. And it's obvious that this little sore that started out because of the use of that tool is getting worse and worse. At the end of 2 weeks, he says to the younger man, I think I know what it is that you have, and I'm sorry to inform you that you have leprosy. You're going to have to leave your wife and your children, your home, your job, and go off and live with the other lepers outside of town. So the man is terrified when he hears this. It's a death sentence, isn't it? And he says, well, I'm not afraid of dying, but this leprosy thing is the most horrible thing I can ever think of. The process of dying by leprosy is worse than dying itself. What he is afraid of is the complete separation and isolation that is about to begin. Although the physical ravages of leprosy are bad, the mental and emotional damage it causes is even worse. They were required to keep far away from healthy people as possible. Whenever someone came near who did not have leprosy, they had to shout. Lepers are never allowed to be near their loved ones again. They can see them from a distance. Imagine that. You just see them from a distance. But this man's leprosy was still only on his hand, and he thought, maybe I could just go home one last time. And he desperately wants to tell his wife and his kids goodbye. He wants to tell them one last time that he really loves them and that he will always be thinking of them. Let me go home and tell them goodbye. I'm sorry, says the man. You cannot ever go home. You can never hold your wife in your arms again. You can never wrestle with your son again. You can never kiss your little girl goodnight before she goes to bed again. You can't go home. You can't touch them. If you love them, you will stay away from home. So the man goes off alone to rot. He couldn't even touch an animal. He couldn't even touch a dog because of the fear that the dog will go back into town and spread the leprosy in there with other people. This man started out truly living a horrible life. His family would come to bring him food every day, but they couldn't get close. They simply had to put it there on a rock, and then they would withdraw from there, and the waving of the day will start. And he would watch his wife as they left, but he was never able to comfort her. After several years of this, he started wishing they wouldn't come anymore. It wasn't that he didn't want to see them, but it was that he didn't want them to see him. He had lost an ear already and several of his fingers and toes. His face was horribly disfigured. His hair was falling out. According to Jewish law, he wore rags for clothing. He knew he looked repulsive. And he didn't want his family to remember him in this way. Some days he just wished he would die. Then one day something happened. Something that this man and his whole family would never ever forget. And that's the first of 4 things that happens in this little story. The leper has a request. Okay? You must follow these 4 things. Forget the story. The leper has a request. We read about it in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 to 16. Jesus was traveling through the cities of Galilee. And in verse 12 it says, And it happened when he was in a certain city that, behold, a man was full of leprosy. And he saw Jesus. Here is this man. His story is probably very similar to the one I've just told you. His situation is probably very similar in terms of speaking to somebody, a physician, who tells him he was a leper and that he was full of leprosy. That verse in the Bible says he was covered in leprosy. It was everywhere. He did not have a light case of leprosy. Can one have a light case of leprosy? It's only bad or worse. Leprosy. Let me tell you a little bit about leprosy. If you don't get the picture yet. Most people think it causes your skin to rot and fall off your body. But that's not really the case. There are numerous forms of leprosy, but the most common form, which we are familiar with, is a disease that causes damage to the body's nervous system. And as a result, leprosy causes you not to be able to feel anything. For people with leprosy, Philip Yancey says, pain is their friend. When they can feel pain, it's just like the best thing ever. And I know what that is. Even now, after, when did I cut my fingers off? 95. Well, what's it now? 20 years, yeah? Even now, you can see it's still a bit disfigured there, or disformed, or whatever. That's all the old nerve that's sitting in there. And if I press on there, it is such a, it's dead. But if you press hard enough, pain comes through, and somehow it is a very good feeling. I don't know what it is. It's something about the nerves. Sometimes, back in the day after the accident, one of Cedrine's jobs was to sit and massage my hand to help the feeling, to help my hand learn how to feel again, you know. And that was just, it was painful, but it was the best feeling ever. She could sit there and work for half an hour, and I would just enjoy it. But it was painful. I don't know. And so it's that you couldn't feel. And as a result, it may cause your whole body to go numb. And when somebody is blind, or they cannot, and you see, they cannot see when they're blind. When somebody is deaf, they cannot hear. When somebody has leprosy, they cannot feel. And the infected parts of their body goes numb and eventually loses all sensitivity. And nerve damage can lead to a dangerous loss of feeling. If a person with leprosy have a cut in their wherever, in their hand or something, and they're not even aware of it, it may be a dangerous cut. And their body's nervous system wouldn't know how to deal with that cut, how to fix it. And even if they cut themselves where they can't even see it, they might never realize, I've just cut myself so bad that something is about, like a toe is busy falling off or something like that. And so technically, having leprosy never actually kills anyone. But imagine what your life would be like if you had leprosy. Sometimes a leper would be cutting vegetables for supper and would accidentally cut off a finger and not even know that this has happened. Sometimes a leper would be sleeping by a fire and would roll too close to the fire, and they would be burning in the fire and not even be aware of that fact. And so on, the same with freezing. And so a leper does not die from leprosy, but from the damage that it causes, because their body can't feel stuff. But you don't need to worry about getting leprosy. 95% of the world's population is naturally immune to leprosy. And most of the 5% who isn't immune can must live in specific areas of the world where it is very tropical and so on. And then, of course, these days they've got very good medicine to deal with leprosy. So for us, it's not really that much of a worry. And the illness itself is not really what I'm after today. It's the secondary bit that comes with the illness. And so it could be one of the saddest things you ever see when somebody has leprosy. It could be one of the most terrible things. These people are cast out from society. They are rejected. They are treated like refuse. Many view them as garbage. They are feared. People are afraid of them. They are neglected. And because leprosy was such a dreaded disease, lepers were, of course, expected to live outside of town and do stuff that no one else had to do, like shouting, "Watch out, watch out." Unclean. One day, this man, he looks up. There's a small group of people following a man who's teaching them as he walks, and he hears his name. They called him Jesus. He has heard some about him, and that he is a teacher, and so on. And he would love to hear this man Jesus teach, but Jesus and the men with him were getting closer, and he knows what the Lord tells him to do, so he starts shouting, "Unclean, unclean, stay away from me, I have leprosy." And just like 1,000 times before, the men with Jesus started retiring immediately. He sees the fear in their eyes, the loathing. He doesn't fault them for that. That's the way they are wired. That's the way they are. He understands. He would look at himself the same way if he was in their position. But something strange happens. Even as the other men draw back, Jesus keeps coming closer. "Unclean," the man shouts louder. "Unclean, Jesus, I am unclean." But Jesus kept coming. Doesn't he know the law? The man thought, "Yeah, is he not hearing me?" If Jesus gets any closer, he will become unclean himself. And the man begins to cover himself in the rags that he had with him. I can imagine he was starting to think, shall I turn around and run? Or what's going on? But by then, Jesus got close enough to look the man in the eyes, and he sees in Jesus' eyes something that he's never seen in many, many years. He doesn't see loathing. He sees concern. He doesn't see fear. He sees empathy. He doesn't see rejection. He sees love. And when he sees this in the eyes of Jesus, he fell on his face. "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." You can almost hear how he's not sure where he needs to be. "Lord, if you are willing, can you make me clean?" He was sick of being treated like garbage. He was sick of being rejected and pushed away. Well, that's where I want to be. It's not so much about the sores on the skin. It's with the sores inside that we can't see. You see, it will be all too easy for us if we can see from the outside what really goes on in the inside of people's hearts. Because what do we do when they don't do stuff the way we do stuff? You're not one of us. There's rules, man. Do you do what we do? There's rules. If you don't want to behave like we do, maybe you want to go somewhere else. That's what we do, unfortunately. That's what we do. But it's not so much only about what we do. I've not come here today to give you all a little rap over the wrist. I've come here to put us in that position. The position where we feel that people do that to us. People often make assumptions and say, well, they know what we think. People often make assumptions and they say, well, I know what your attitude is and I know what your ambitions are. And we often feel mistreated. We often feel overlooked and that other people look down on us, don't you? If you can't really say that you feel like that ever, then you must be a rhino with a thick skin or something. But I know we all do. And what do we do when that happens? What do we do when we feel people are rejecting us and pushing us out just because we differ from them because of our thoughts or whatever? Do what the man did. Ask Jesus. In fact, the word implore is used there. It's a very, very strong word when he said, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And if you want to make translate it from the Greek, it would be a very, very strong, please, Lord, I beg you. Can you clean me? He was desperate. Do you ever go to God and implore? We say, God, I've got this problem and I'm hoping you can help me with it, but if not, I'll just continue to deal with it the way I've been doing the past few years. God, if you, please, God, please. Just once. And then it doesn't happen and we say, okay. Have you ever come to a place where you really get stuck with God? And you really speak to Him deeply. And asking Him to take you somewhere or do something for you that you are really desperate about. You know you need help. And it's not help that any human can give you. You need divine help. You need God's help. This leper doesn't turn to one of the disciples. He doesn't turn to another leper. He doesn't even turn to the priest. He knows that none of them can help him. He has to speak to Jesus and he says, Lord, if you're willing, you will make me clean. You can make me clean. And even though he's imploring Jesus, he's not making demands. He's not telling God what he had better do. Nor is he making empty threats like, God, you better do this for me or I'm going to stop going to church. I'm sure no one of us has ever done that. God is not mocked. God is not threatened. You cannot force God into doing anything for you. And I'm often thinking, even though, and I'm probably very guilty of all this that I've just said, oh God, if you will, I'm probably often thinking that maybe God's will is different. We're all guilty of that, aren't we? Do you sometimes feel like a leper? Call out to Jesus and to make you clean. Implore Him to make you clean, to change you, to cleanse you. Beg with Him, plead with Him. Lord, if you're willing, these people are just pushing me away. There's something about me that makes them afraid of me. Will you help me? So, what was it? The leper's request. That was the one, yes? The second one? From here on it goes quick. So you must listen. All the big stuff has been said now. The second one is the Lord's reach. The leper's request, the Lord's reach. The leper requests, the Lord reaches. Verse 13. Then he put his hand out and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately the leprosy left him. And I love this about Jesus. He put his hand out to touch him. I'm almost thinking, because of the fact that the leper wasn't really sure if he should stay or should he go, because if somebody touches him, they're going to get leprosy. So the law says you need to shout out and you need to, stay away from people. And I'm almost thinking in my mind, when Jesus came close to him, he had to act fast because just now the leper may just turn around. So he might have grabbed him. Sort of, I don't know. Think about it. I'm not trying to tell you what the Bible is not saying. I'm just saying, to me, it makes sense that maybe there was not just a touch, but a lot more physical activity. Yes? How many years has it been since someone had hugged this man? How many years since someone had done something as simple as touching him on the shoulder and saying, everything will be okay, my friend? How many years do you think it had been since this man has been touched by anyone? He couldn't even pet a dog without it being killed. Jesus knows this, so he puts out his hand on the man and he touches him. In fact, the word is much stronger for touch. The Greek could literally be translated, Jesus took hold of him. He does this all the time, Jesus. He's involved with people. And then and you can read many other stories in the gospel. Jesus was once healing somebody who wasn't even in the same vicinity. Jesus, if you will, can you please heal? Can you make alive, actually? Jesus doesn't have to be right there and touch them to actually heal them. He doesn't even have to touch them. He doesn't even have to be there. But he does. He does. And he can heal with just a word. He can heal from a great distance. And he just knows what this leper needs. It's much more than just for the sores on his skin to be taken away. What's the worst thing about soldiers? Is the war bad? Yes, the war is bad. But what is it that soldiers sit with for years after the war? It's a psychological illness. It's inside. It's invisible. Jesus is interested in healing that side of us as well as healing the physical. Why does he do this? It was a radical thing for him to do. According to the Jewish law, if a person touched someone who was unclean, they became unclean also. So why did Jesus do this? First of all, he did it for the sake of the leper. Christ never heals anybody to show others that he can heal. Christ never heals anybody to attract attention or gain public fame. He simply wanted to show love to the leper. That's all. Christ was not scared of the sores or put off by the rotting flesh. The touch said, I am here with you. I sympathize with you. And when no one else is here, I love you, says Christ. Do you ever feel like a leper? Jesus says the same thing to you and me today. When we are walking around the place with all those scars that are sitting inside that nobody can see. Because when we come to church on Sabbath morning, we are all behaving nicely and nobody can see all the scars that we have. I am here with you, says Christ. I sympathize with you when no one else does. I understand you and I love you. But beyond this, I believe Jesus shows the leper another reason. Remember, he has just called a few disciples before this story to be his disciples. And now he's also teaching them how to catch men, how to be fishers of men. And he needs to show them that there is place in the ministry. We're all ministers, aren't we? Every believer a minister. There's place in the ministry for us to go beyond the nice parts of life. Sometimes we have to go there where it stinks. Sometimes we have to go there where it's not nice, and touch and deal with and care for those who don't often look, do, or think the same as we do. Too often we as Christians do our best to avoid non-Christians. Rather than seek them out, we often run from them because we are scared that the situation might rise, that we might have to befriend them. What if they don't like the stuff we do? And you know what? Awkward situations will arise. But if we're going to be effective in our evangelism, we must reach out and we must touch the unsaved, because they certainly are not going to come into church if they get the message that we are not willing to touch them. This man needed to be touched, and so Jesus touched him. He didn't tell the man to come to the synagogue next Sabbath to listen to the sermon. If he did so, the man probably would never have come. He was not accepted there. That's the only rule he knows. I'm not accepted there. I'm not accepted anywhere in town. Why should I go to the synagogue? Who in your life needs to be touched? Who in your neighborhood needs a loving word said to them or a kind deed done for them? In verse 14 it says, "And he charged him to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing as a testimony to them, just as Moses commanded." Jesus tells the man to go and do two things. First of all, tell no one. This seems like a strange command, but we will see that in verse 15 there's a bit of light on this. Let us look at the second command. Jesus told him, secondly, to go to show himself to a priest and make an offering as a testimony to them. And though the Old Testament law had offerings and ceremonies for the person who had been cleansed of leprosy, such cleansing was very rare. And in fact, in the Bible, prior to this event, we only read of 3 people who had been cleansed of leprosy, and one of them wasn't even Jewish. Cleansing from this form of leprosy was always miraculous. So, when this man shows up, cleansed and healed, at the priest's doorstep, the priest would have known that something amazing has just happened. Possibly this was the very priest who had pronounced this man unclean a few years earlier. And now here he is again. But he's whole and he's healed. He looks like he used to look before he was ill. The religious leaders of the day had developed a list of signs which would accompany the coming of the Messiah. One of them was the healing of those with leprosy. Something great has just happened. This man came to the priest and announced himself. When Jesus tells the man to go and make an offering, it was to be a testimony to the priests that the Messiah had come. And later in chapter 5, you read that they don't respond very well to this idea that Jesus is the Messiah. Which brings us around to the question of why Jesus didn't want him to go spreading the news all over town. Wouldn't God get more publicity if this man was actually able to go around town and tell everybody, hey, Jesus did this? But of course, we know as the stories develop from here that Jesus got some appeal from here on in. Number 3, first one was the leper requested. The second one was Jesus. What did I say? Reached. The third one is now the crowd requests. I'm not going to take too much time in this. And what do you think the fourth one is? Jesus responds to the crowd how? He retreats. The leper asks, Jesus comes. The crowd comes, and they ask, why? Because they saw, hey, check this man. He can make sick people healthy again. So they come with their mobile phones and their selfie sticks, and they want a part of the action. What does Jesus do? He retreats. And he goes and he prays, be alone. One last thing. Philip Yancey writes about how Henry Nouwen, if you ever get the chance to read Henry Nouwen's book, you must do so. Philip Yancey writes about Henry Nouwen, how he worked among AIDS victims in San Francisco. Many Christians have probably thought at times that it would God's just judgment if San Francisco fell into the ocean. But Henry Nouwen tells of young men who are dying, many of them banished from their own families, forced out to hustle on the street. Many of them had hundreds of relationships, but they are dying. They are cast off from society. They are rejected. And Nouwen says that all they want is to be loved. Well, all of them knew they did something wrong at some point. Is it necessary to reiterate the point? All they want is to be loved. They want a safe place. They want a safe relationship, a place to call home, someone to accept them. That's all they want. Someone to love them, someone to forgive them. Of course, they are looking for love in all the wrong places. But that is no reason to reject them or to fear them. Henry Nouwen has also worked among orphanages in Peru. And he writes this: how little do we really know the power of physical touch? The boys and girls only wanted one thing: to be touched, hugged, stroked, caressed. Probably most adults have the same needs, but no longer have the innocence and unself-consciousness to express them. Sometimes I see humanity as a sea of people starving for affection, tenderness, care, love, acceptance, forgiveness, and gentleness. Everyone seems to cry, "Please love me." That was the cry of this leper. That's the cry of many people we all come into contact with every day. Let us be like Jesus and reach out and touch the untouchables. Maybe that way we will also feel that love that we need. May God bless you.